Ah, there we go. Okay, let's see. Anyway, so this is an experiment. We'll see how it goes, and we'll adjust our future meetings on the basis of how this goes. Let's see, some opening comments for anybody who's looking at telescopes right now or knows somebody who is. And I'm sure any of you who have a telescope and use it regularly get asked, you know, what's the scope I should buy? And this is my budget. And a lot of times the starter budget's pretty low. It's very much caveat emptor right now. I feel like the beginner scopes that are being offered, even by the big brand names, there's a lot of junk. Um, we've gone backwards. We had a lot of junky scopes in the 70s and through the early 80s, and then after the advent of the Dobsonian, we had, and pressure by a lot of astronomers to improve the quality of scopes being sold to beginners. There was a lot of improvement, and most of the really junk scopes got moved to the off brands and were just oddball things that would crop up once a year at the department stores for Christmas to be sold to people who wanted to buy them for usually like a grandchild. Um, and most of the scopes, you can pretty much tell somebody if you go with a name brand, you're going to get a decent scope. You're going to get something that's at least usable. That's no longer the case. I am regularly seeing sales under brand names and under names that are well known, even if they're not the more established brand names. They're selling not just spotting scopes as astronomical scopes, but they're selling really junky spotting scope, astronomical scopes. They've got a mount that couldn't even hold it steady for pointing at something on land, much less pointing at something in the sky. If you've got like one of the camera style tripod mounts where it's got the twisty handle that you use for adjusting it in altitude against a spring, if you've got a 10-inch long handle on that thing with that twist to lock it, you have to position that thing accurately to within about a 20th of an inch just to get the moon in. And if that's for the moon, imagine for something dimmer or for something smaller, which everything's smaller and dimmer than the moon pretty much. It just makes it impossible. It turns into a source of frustration. And when a beginner is using a scope and it's not working out, who do they blame? They don't blame the manufacturer. They don't say, oh, they sold this astroscope that really isn't adequate to be used for astronomy. They say, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm no good at science. I'm no good at astronomy. And it can kill a lot of their interest. And that's why, you know, I and a lot of other people, we really try to get on the manufacturers when they're selling junk, call them out for it, and try to get people away from buying junk. But yeah, it's kind of a shocking situation right now. There really is a lot of junk on the market. And I've seen ones with handles that aren't even 10 inches. They're only 4 or 5 inches long. They're barely big enough to put a plastic molded handle on them. And there's no way somebody can set up, and they're flimsy. They're wobbly. They're thin legs. They're like the junk ones you get with a video camera that you would throw away because it's no good to use with a video camera. With a telescope, any little wiggle here on Earth is going to send you way off looking out in space. So yeah, if people are asking you, make sure that they don't buy the junk Altaz mounts. Plus, we've seen the fork mounts from the 60s come back where the trunnions aren't perfectly round and it sits in this fork and it won't control it in altitude, even if it has the little extra screw that goes along the side that you can twist supposedly for slow motion movement or to lock it down. It just doesn't lock properly. So a lot of these bad designs, you've got Chinese taking molds off of old Japanese scopes that were crappy molds taken off of American and German designs from the 40s and 50s. And it's all back again. All the junk is back. So that's my opening comments on telescopes right now is look out and try to steer people away from this stuff, because even Celestron and Meade are selling things that are just, they're dumpster trash, and warn people away from that stuff. So tonight we've got 3 presenters lined up. I see 2 of them. Let's see, we've got some more people waiting. Let me admit them. And the people I had for tonight were Jeffrey Cohen, Charlie Hanf, and John Carter. And you won't need to, those of you who are showing your scopes. You don't have to fill any specific amount of time. We'll just take one at a time, and we'll see how far we get. And if we hit a stopping point where we've run into something that is going to take some additional work offline to sort that out, then we'll just we'll move forward. We may have some time for questions and answers at the end, and we can also potentially have some conversation during, especially if we're waiting on someone doing something. So let's see. Yeah, we've got Charlie and John here. Would one of you like to volunteer to go first? John? All right. So why don't we start with John? And if those of you who are watching go to speaker view, then that will hopefully allow us to go ahead and watch John and his scope big enough. And let's see.
Is the size of my scope okay? I mean, the view of it.
Yeah, I can see it pretty well when I'm in speaker view. I've got a good view of your scope.
Okay. Well, I've been practicing for all week my pronunciation of catadioptric, because that's what this is. I heard somebody talking about a 6-inch. I believe this is a 6-inch catadioptric scope. It's my first scope, and it came about 18 days before the convergence. So we hustled and hustled to be able to see it, and we ended up getting a good view of it. But I've got about 12 bullet points that pertain to, if you purchase a new scope, where are the places that you're going to burn your fingers on the hot stove? And the first thing I'd say is, when the package comes, don't throw the packing away. And the reason is because when you go look for aftermarket boxes or things to store it or carry it, you're not going to get anything that matches. So that's my first bullet point. Before the second thing, before you bring it outside, make sure you've got a pretty complete system of keeping all the little pieces and parts in a safe place, that so you have your area lit. Some people use a red light. I've been using a little white light flashlight, but I'm talking about eyepieces and lens covers, power sources, and that kind of thing. The third thing is, my wife and I had probably an hour's discussion about, well, when should we use the vibration dampening pads? And we had different theories. Well, if we put it on the grass, or if we don't need it on concrete, or here's the answer: always. You never want to not use vibration pads. And the simple reason is, from my observation, my hands are reasonably steady, but anytime they're on the telescope is wiggling, period. When I set up, I use this little, I don't know if you can see it. It's a Stanley 8-foot or 8-inch level. And I don't know if you can see right in here, right in this area.
Mm-hmm.
There are 3 set screws down under here that unscrew, and that's what holds the mount onto the tripod. The tripod is it's a pretty beefy tripod. But I just set this here, here, and here, and then adjust the feet. And I think that's pretty important. It's important with alignment. So level it always before you use it, and always use the dampening pads. I've got a question that sort of came up that when we first started to align it, there was there was ambiguity between our written instructions and what scrolled through the hand controller. And the more important one that I would say is what comes through the hand controller, because you kind of got to do what it says or it gets mad.
Right.
So we encountered a problem between, it said, in the written instructions, it said, select between true north or magnetic north. But the dirty, rotten hand controller never gave us that choice. So it defaulted to true north. So what that leads a question to anybody who knows. I suppose we could look it up online if we were really eager beavers about it. But the declination between magnetic north and true north, we've got to plug that in somehow. But
yeah.
6.3 degrees.
You need to consult the map.
Is it 6.3 degrees? Does anybody know here?
It varies. It varies with where you are. I was a navigator, and it changed. You had to that difference had to be read off a map.
Is it very, very precise? Like if my neighbor, would I be the same as my neighbor, or is there that much of a difference?
Oh yeah.
Yes, there is. Okay. So another thing that is crucial, and I can attest to this, on your eyepieces, I've got a little box. This is a 12 millimeter eyepiece here, and this is a zoom. It's an 8 to 24. So I was pretty pumped up having the 8 to 24. I said I've got about 16 eyepieces in here, and I continued to be pumped up when I looked at the moon, and it was looking pretty good. And then I said, well, let's go up to Mars. This was up here, and when it slewed down and got into this area, there was a little argument about who was going to occupy what territory. This in the base of the mount, so that's no good.
Right.
So don't make that mistake.
You need an angle.
Yeah, a diagonal.
Yes. Well, I have there was a diagonal on it.
Okay.
But the size of the zoom, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a big eyepiece.
I had done that with a little a single eyepiece, but this is that much bigger, so it came into contact with the. Let me see. Oh yeah, I'll admit to making this mistake. If you can't see anything through your telescope, if you've used it before, you've seen it, but it's all dark, take off the lens cover.
Mm-hmm.
It'll trap you, but you don't think it's going to trap you, but guess what? Also, I could be mistaken, but I think that the focus, I do a lot with photography, and I'm embarrassed at how little I really know about the relationship between focal length, magnification, and aperture, the optics of how these eyepieces and the different things work. So it appears to me that when I'm focusing, if I'm not even close, I could never get it. You've got to be focused in on some distant object to be halfway close. Otherwise, my screen seems to look like a big dark maze.
Yeah, you have to kind of search around for when you're getting in focus, because when you're out of focus, it scatters the light.
exactly.
And
Yep.
if you don't have sufficient contrast, you can't even tell that there's an image there. And we've got low contrast skies, so that's an extra challenge for us. Focusing on something that's a good ways away, like a faraway tree or something like that, gets you close because you want to be focused at infinity for the eyepiece you're using. The other thing that you can do to make it easier on yourself is to do what's called parfocalizing of your eyepieces. And it's a fancy sounding word, but what it does is it makes it so that your different eyepieces will all focus at the same focus setting or something close to it where it just takes a little tweak instead of a lot of searching in and out. And they sell what are called parfocalizing rings. And it's they go onto the barrel of the eyepiece, and you essentially adjust them and then set a set screw or otherwise adjust them. I have a set of plastic ones that are like a just a little piece of tubing that goes over. And what you do is you measure the length for each eyepiece to get it to focus at the same place. You adjust until you find your eyepiece that has the focus that goes in the furthest. Once you've got that, you slide each of the other ones in there and you pull the barrel out. And then when it comes in focus by manually focusing it by just sliding the barrel in and out, you lock it down. You take a millimeter rule or something like that, and you measure how far out it is. You cut the rings to that length, or you set the ring at that length if it's one of the set screw type. And then that way, from then on, whenever you stick an eyepiece in, once you've focused for one eyepiece, all the rest of the eyepieces are focused in, and you don't have to refocus every single time that you.
That sounds very, very useful.
It saves so much time and trouble. I parfocalized my eyepieces years ago, and it was great till I got a new eyepiece that wasn't parfocalized with the rest. And of course, that's the one that has to be racked in the furthest. So I have to go and do all mine all over again. But it makes it easy as long as I leave the one eyepiece out of my rotation. If I'm just using my other eyepieces, I focus once and leave it all night.
Well, the frustrating thing with the way it's been working with this one is there's the thing that the focuser that you twist,
Mm-hmm.
you start out not knowing there's no reference point.
Right.
It just keeps going around and around and around. You can't. I wish it started and stopped someplace.
Yeah, no, it would be, and with a regular rack and pinion, you can see how far in or out you are, but in this case, you can't. You have no visual thing to tell.
This is a mead. Is this a piece of junk?
No, you've actually got a fine scope.
Oh, well, I better learn how to use it better.
It's just the construction of the scope doesn't show you stuff that you would see on a scope of different construction because of the way the focus is performed by moving the main mirror. And that's how it does the focus. You can put an index mark or a scratch into your focus knob, and that way at least you can have kind of a reference point.
Yeah. We would have been afraid to do that until you told us.
Yeah.
But now it's okay.
It's okay. And in fact, you can even buy different knobs for them. There's one company that, a guy started a company in his garage and it really took off called Bob's Knobs. And he sells replacement knobs, focus knobs that give you a little bit of grip. They're a bit larger, so you don't have just a tiny little thing that you're grabbing and twisting. Yours is not as bad as the old ones. The old ones, we used to have things that were, less than a centimeter across. And when
this is a nicely knurled knob, and it's about an inch or rough.
And that's a huge improvement over the old one.
Can I ask a question about it? You mentioned the idea of a notch. If you say, for instance, you focused and got, because it's so easy, the moon pretty well in focus, would you kind of put a little notch on the top of that focus knob so that you have there's an object out there and it's in focus, and this is where the moon is. I get it.
Yeah, you can do that. You can. One of the things I use for doing that sort of thing a lot is just a piece of vinyl tape. And, you can feel it with your thumb in the dark. It makes a bump.
I get it.
Yeah.
And then you can match the bumps up against each other and you can know, okay, that's where my focus is. And if you don't have your eyepieces parfocalized, you can even put on like different length of pieces of tape. And so you say, okay, this is the focus for my medium power eyepiece, and the short one is the one for my, high power eyepiece, because that's got the shortest focal length. And you can know, okay, I need to twist it left and I need to turn it about a quarter of a turn to get that one in focus.
Very
And
helpful, thank you.
with the other mark that's on the body. So you can do a scratch, you can do a bead of nail polish. You can, there's a lot of different ways you can mark it.
Yeah.
So another thing that I've run into this problem and learned what a dummy I was. There are 9 slew speeds.
Yeah.
And the first 4 times we used it, we got onto Saturn and we got onto this using one speed, number 9. That's the fastest. It's a lot easier if it right in the manual, believe it or not, it says which slew speeds to use for which objects in the sky. And guess what? It works a lot better that way.
Yeah.
I admit it.
I usually use the
yeah.
high speed for big slews, but once I get in the general area, I slow down.
Yeah. There is one persnickety thing. Somebody mentioned the 8-inch. Was it an 8-inch Cassegrain you were talking about? Bert was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
This was 40 pounds or something like that.
Yeah, about 45 pounds for that tube assembly.
The optical tube is not bad. It's 9.2 pounds, but it requires more diligence and care than the mount. And the mount is to me, it's heavy. I can carry it like a suitcase with this handle, but it's 18 pounds. So that's not inconsequential. And I could assemble the rest of it. This little cap comes off, and this is where there's an eyepiece adapter that goes in first.
Right.
Then either an eyepiece or a diagonal.
Your visual back, and then yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's a little compass that we put in every time to just double check the level. That just goes in the top of the diagonal to let us know. But this is the red dot finder that came with it. And really and truly, we don't have any complaint about the red dot finder, but they can be improved upon.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
most of the common red dot finders.
I love, this is a scientific, American Scientific or Scientific Explorer. I've forgotten who, some company like that made it.
Yeah.
It's a really nice finder scope, but it's made by Explore Scientific.
Right.
So I had an awful problem. I'll take it up. I'll show you what the problem was. This is probably not going to be able to show very clearly, but I can tell you the male part of the dovetail here, where my fingers are, is 1.25 inches. And I'm here to tell you that the corresponding part on the Meade mount is 1.25 inches. But what came with this scope was 3/4 inch.
Yeah.
So I had to buy this adapter piece. And when it first got here, it would not go on. So it was me and a file.
Yeah.
And I worked it down. I would say I went after it 20 times because I didn't want to overdo it. And got it small enough so it would fit reasonably snug, and then covered it over with some acrylic paint so nobody would ever know that I fussed with it.
So that's
I did. It works.
Is that a 50 millimeter finder? Or thereabouts?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yep.
Now, there's a few things I'd like to point out for people who see telescopic finders on scopes. Most of the time, you're not going to find one this large when it's sold with the scope.
Right.
This has enough aperture to capture enough light to create a good image to use as a finder. When you go below this, there are some 35 millimeter finders that'll work. Most of the ones included with scopes are 10, 15, or 20 millimeters, and it's just not enough light area to capture an image for you to find your way around. The other thing is if you hold up the holder for the finder, you'll notice it has 2 rings, and those rings each have 3 screws. And that's what it takes to align it. The cheap little stalks that they sell on the low-end scopes have only 3 screws, and they only have a single ring. And that's not enough to line up a finder. It'll wobble within that. So the cheap ones on the department store type scopes cannot hold a finder. So if you have a telescopic finder like this is what you want to have for a finder if you're going to use a telescopic finder. If you're looking at a scope to buy and it doesn't have 6 screws holding the finder, the telescopic finder, you know that finder is something that you're just going to want to take off and throw away, or give it to a kid to play with. You know, you'll have to get one of these, or you're going to have to get a Telrad or another good reflex sight. And then, yeah, I've seen a lot of pretty bad red dots for sale too. A lot of the red dots, you can't adjust the brightness of the dot down to where it's dim enough to use at night. They're just taking a cheap one that's used for an air gun during the daytime, and they're putting it on the scope. So that's something else to watch out for. But that's a great finder you've got. You know,
Mark, you've done a great job covering that this is the adjustment mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate like a little more? Because I've had to work this, we haven't actually honed in the finder.
Okay.
So we understand it's a process of manipulating the screws, but if you got any pointers, that's a great pointer about don't underdo it on an aftermarket finder.
Right. So for aligning it, what I would do is you want to align it in the front set of screws more or less centered. So what I'll often do is use a scrap of cork or something like that that's got a little bit of thickness to it to use as kind of a shim to slip in there, and just make sure it's kind of centered all the way around. So once I've done that, then the actual alignment I do with the rear set of screws. And I do that by alternately loosening on one side and tightening on the other until you get it where you want. And you just need to do slightly snug while you're adjusting. You don't need to gronk it down while you're adjusting. And then once you get it aligned with what you see in the main scope, then snug it up, and that way it'll stay where it goes. But
thank you so much. That's vaguely familiar, but I'm going to suggest that listening to your explanation of what to do and how to do it is 20 times easier to understand than whatever it says in the manual.
The manuals tend to get overcomplicated, and often the verbiage is copied from something that's literally 100 years old. And, you know, is far too involved for just practical observation out under the sky.
Thank you.
I had the problem with the Meade ETX 125 that I had when I got it originally. I was amazed at the red dot finder was such that if I was 12 years old, I could possibly get into the position to see where the red dot was pointing. When I'm now 80 years old, I don't have the ability to be in that position. So when I got the scope and I I saw another scope at a starry night that had a Telrad, which has right angle capabilities. And it also has a target, and you can dim the light on the target so that you can see the object that you're trying to find. And it makes it so much easier. It's so much more of a pleasurable experience. And once you affix it to the scope properly, the set screws, the whole thing finds itself very easily. Every time you take it off the scope and put it back on, and tighten the screws to hold it to the mount, the original settings of the finder with those set screws that you're talking about, just nails it right on target all the time. And but more than that, it's the position that you need to work with when working with a red dot finder. I really object to the fact that there isn't a right angle view on the finder scope, because doing a straight through view when you're trying to go vertical, when you happen to want to go look at the moon or something else that's directly overhead, is just impossible. You and I can't get in that position anymore.
Well, if they made cots that were adjustable by the ½ inch, that it might come close, but it would only come close.
Yeah, I
Is
love
this,
sorry.
this, I didn't mention, but this is illuminated. There's this little,
Oh.
I don't know what they call it.
Reticle.
Reticle, yeah.
Yeah, it's got a crosshair in it that lights up. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, they're
I'm not sure it helps alignment. It just helps you, acquire the target.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the Telrads. That's usually the first thing that'll tell somebody to buy if they've got an otherwise decent scope, they're having trouble with it, because after the mount, the next most important part of any telescope is the finder. The scope has to be able to point at and stay on whatever you point it at, and that's the mount's job. And then the next thing is you have to be able to point the scope at whatever the mount's holding it on. And without those two parts, it doesn't matter what kind of an optical system you've got. You could have a cheap refractor with plastic lenses, and you'll get more out of it with a good mount and with a good finder than you would out of a $1,200 optical tube assembly that's on a bad mount and that you don't have a decent finder on. So yeah, you never want to skip on the finder. And I know for a lot of people, it's hard after you feel like you've stretched for the scope to go spend more money on a finder. I usually advise people when buying a scope to spend no more than 2/3 of your budget on the scope and what comes with it as a pack-in, and save the rest for plus-ups like a better finder, for any minor modifications you might need to make to the mount. If you're going to buy luggage to carry it in, custom luggage through JMI or something like that, then only spend half your budget on the scope, because getting good luggage is well worthwhile if you're going to be toting a scope around a lot. My little ETX 90, I actually spent more on the JMI carrying case, the carrying case for the tripod, and on the other accessories that I bought for it, like the finder, than I spent on the scope itself. The scope itself, I think, was $300 because they were blowing out the older model of ETX. And then the rest of it, I think I spent about $400 on. All right, there we are. That's a beautiful case.
That I just bought the case, and it had a solid foam block. It was in 3 layers.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of took a look at what accessories I thought would be most useful right off the bat, and sort of mapped them out before I did any cutting. And I have to admit, the last thing I added was that little pencil, the reticle,
Yeah.
because that is difficult to store by itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, my illuminated reticle eyepiece has that attached, and so I had to cut a special hole for it into my case. I added the foam to my case. My case was an old case for carrying a strain gauge kit, and it's very sturdy, and it had the right general size of dividers with it. So I've converted it into an eyepiece case, and I stuck my own foam in and then cut the foam by hand. And yeah, the illuminated reticle eyepiece needed a special place.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's see, one question about the scope. How easy or difficult is it to put the mount on top of the tripod? Is that relatively easy?
The first time it was pretty darn confusing and difficult. The second time it was significantly less so, because I did the equivalent of, when you said put a little notch on your focuser.
Yeah.
There are three little pieces of, I don't know if you probably can't see them, but right here,
I see. Yeah.
there's a little arrow.
Uh-huh.
I was trying to align thinking the bolts were here,
Yeah.
and it needed to be a sixth. It needed to be a sixth of the way, either clockwise or counterclockwise, and it's got a centering post that'll get you close.
Okay.
Once you get close to one, you can feel the thread. And what I do is I kind of hold it like this. I just play with it a little bit, tilt it this way, and then screw this one in three or four quarter turns, and then go around and get them all even, and then zip, 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 zip. And now it's pretty quick.
Oh, cool.
But as I mentioned earlier, the optical tube is a little bit more fussy. And the reason is just because it's awkward. I won't take it off, but it's got the dovetail thing, dovetail attachment right over here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lock on this particular model. There's another Vixen saddle that will accommodate up to a 7-pound optical tube assembly.
Oh.
So as part of that, there's a clutch or a lock, and in the slewing instructions, it said it's pretty important to get this. I've unloosened the clutch, so this up and down, and it's pretty important to get it roughly level, roughly in balance. Otherwise, it'll be problematic in the slewing. And it's a little. I also find it a little awkward. I'm kind of holding the optical tube like this and working the set screw down on top of it, and it always makes me nervous.
Yeah.
I'm just holding the optical tube and kind of making sure it's seated properly in the dovetail saddle, and screwing it in. But that's just how the difference in attaching that versus the mount.
Right. Yeah. Let's see. One thing to answer the question about slewing. Slewing is like panning and tilting. It's moving from one location to another. So that's the answer to that question. Let's see. One thing that I did on my stellar view, which also sits in a dovetail, is that on one end of the dovetail, I drilled and tapped a hole, and then I put a screw with a bumper on it on there, so that I can kind of slide it in and it won't slide through the dovetail and fall out the other side, just as a safety. And so now when I put it into its base, As long as I know I've got that dovetail engaged and it slides, I know it's not just going to keep on sliding through and fall on the ground and bust my expensive stellar view telescope. So,
Right,
so
right. Isn't that funny? The finder scope has a little set screw like that.
okay, good, good.
It's already in there, but
Yeah.
that would be pretty easy.
But yeah, adding some sort of a safety stop for the scope's dovetail so that it won't slide through the mating dovetail and just fall out. Let's see. The other
Yeah.
question was about a focusing motor, and focusing motors are typically used for astrophotography first. However, for visual astronomy, they're also useful when you get one that gives you a number. So that you can know that, say, this eyepiece will focus on, 22, and the other one will focus on 35, and the other one will focus on 15. So you can get ones that give you a numerical readout. And that's often an option for an electronic focuser, depending on who you get it from. A lot of these electronic mounts have a focuser that you can get that matches to the mount. And then there's also third-party ones. So you'll want to look at whether it has the option to give you a visual numerical readout of the focus position when you look at that, if you're going to be using it for visual astronomy, well, even for photography. And that way you can know you get your focus.
Yep. Ken, that is the question you asked about service. That's the one thing that if I'm going to get ulcers, that's why I'm going to get them.
Why is that?
Well, I haven't had any experience with them yet, but that's because I haven't had to. But the word everywhere I go is that they're notoriously poor. I hadn't heard that they were in bankruptcy, but
yeah, and beyond that, there are third parties that do service for the scopes, and in fact, most people who require their scope to be optically aligned. There's I can't remember his name right now, but there's a fellow in Kansas who does this regularly as a business, and I usually recommend people ship off to him or to one of the other people who do this as a third party. It's often a lot cheaper. They're much more responsive, and you don't have to worry about them suddenly ending up in bankruptcy court and not being able to deliver services because they can't get to their own money, or they just don't have the money to hire the technicians to do the work. So yeah.
Would you say a Meade scope is a pretty good scope to try, or versus the Celestron?
I would take Celestron. I think that in recent years, Celestron's engineering has been significantly better. I've interacted with the engineering teams of both companies, and in recent years, I really feel like for Celestron's premier scopes, their engineers have really been able to do more to produce a quality scope than the Meade people who've been crunched on production costs, on cutting corners, and oftentimes been undermined by their own management. So the Meade scopes are not bad scopes. I own Meades myself, but the new ones being produced, there's more likelihood of problems coming from the factory. And just overall, I don't think the designs are quite as well executed. There are features on the Meades that should work better than they do. So yeah.
Thanks a bunch.
When I originally purchased my ETX 125, I had a strip of gear because the gears themselves on the Ascension, as well as the left to right, when the I had an attachment on the scope where the scope went vertical with something. There's not enough space where the harp that's holding the scope. When the scope went vertical, and there was something like a camera affixed to the back of the unit, when it went vertical, it almost snapped off. But what it did was strip the gears, which are polyester. There were plastic gears, and we ended up, my friend Jeff Tong was able to order metal gears from a third party that ended up replacing the original gears that were in with the mount, and we were able to fix the problem. But I learned my lesson that you never affix anything to the, when you have a scope which is like the ETX 125 and several of the other scopes that I've seen, and you're into thinking about astrophotography, you really have to be concerned about where the photography portion of the unit that you're going to use affixes to the scope, because if it goes vertical,
Yeah.
trying to follow something, it's going to mean a major problem. But you really have to have your intent when you make a purchase about what you really want to do in the future. Otherwise, you end up buying different scopes for different purposes. So that a friend of mine that lives over at the plantation, who has made presentations to the club years ago, he has like 9 telescopes, or 9 or 10 telescopes. He doesn't have a car in the garage. He has telescopes in the garage.
Well, that's what I had before I moved.
So you really have to have your thought process in buying a telescope. Your mindset tends to broaden as you about what you would like to do. So from a standpoint of how you start and where you start, you really have to have somebody advise you, because to read all the literature, or to go to Celestron or Meade, they've got so much variety of equipment out there, and there's so much more in the aftermarket of suppliers of auxiliary equipment that you might want to eventually purchase because of its uniqueness. And then you find out that it doesn't work with the scope that you purchased. And you only find out by experiment that these things, they're not universally adaptable to an existing telescope.
Right. But you also don't want to over anticipate, because you don't really know what your interests are going to be.
Right.
So if you're buying your first scope, just be aware that if you continue with the hobby, if you get interested in it, it's probably not going to be your last scope, and that's okay. So consider that when you're budgeting. I was also asked, what do I consider a premier scope? Generally something that's over $1,000. One of the ones that are the ones they put in the big picture in their full page ads. So in those better scopes, when you get below the $1,000 to $1,200 mark, then there are compromises made. They aren't necessarily bad compromises, but they do need to manage their costs. And then when you get to the below $500 mark, you're starting to get into the stuff that's it's a bit of a minefield. And you might be able to get a good scope that you can do things with and add to and build on there, but it's going to be more difficult than if you start out with something that's got a better base. Like a really good mount, say, is the Celestron AVX mount, the advanced VX mount, and the mount alone costs $600. So once you put an optical tube assembly on there and you get your eyepieces and you get your finder put on it, you know, you're already getting up to $1,000 scope. It doesn't mean you have to start with $1,000 scope, especially if you're not sure if this is something that you're really going to get into. But when you are looking at a serious scope, you'll be wanting to look at what are all the pieces. My mount is actually better than what my telescope needs. And that's because at some point I plan to upgrade the scope that goes on that mount. And I bought the mount for the next telescope, not for the telescope that's actually on it. So when you see me with my stellar view 110 millimeter scope on it, that mount is a gorilla compared to what it's holding. And it can hold a lot of accessories with that scope, but it was bought because I intend to buy a larger scope, 120 to 130 millimeter stellar view if I win the lottery or get an extra check someday. And then I'll have the mount that will hold that scope. Okay, well, let's see. One item, catadioptric. Yeah, I'll break that word down for you. In Latin, cata means chain, di means two, of course, and optric means, optics. So you have a chain of two different types of optics, and that's where that horrible, scary sounding word catadioptric comes from. It's Latin, and it's spliced together from three other Latin words. So it's confusing when people hear it. It just, in this case, means you've got both a lens and a reflecting element. It's got a lens at the front that basically gathers the light for the mirror, and then the mirror reflects the light, usually off of another mirror that's a secondary mirror to bring the image to the eyepiece. So that's what catadioptric means. That includes Schmidt-Casagrins, it includes Moxitovs, and there's others too, but the main ones you're going to see on the market are Moxitovs and Schmidt-Casagrins. Okay, well, let's see. John, you ready to bring us your scope? Or sorry, Charlie. We just got John.
Oh, good. I was afraid he was going to go again.
Yeah, no, we got him. Thank you.
So was I.
We appreciate it. It was very good. I appreciate you doing that, and I'm excited to see what you're doing with that scope. So now let's move on to Charlie, and he's got a reflector.
I've got a simple reflector that I was granted from our next door neighbor who wanted to get it out of her garage. She didn't have a manual. I put it together by downloading a manual. I think I did it right. I think the mount, you guys are using all kinds of terms that to a newbie like me, I'm not sure I understand them all, but I got the idea of a mount. And I think my mount is part of the tripod. And it's all one piece. And then I've got scope on the, I guess you called it a fork, although this is more of an all the way around kind of a holder. It's a Meade. It's a 114 EQ, I think, is the model. And I did take it out when we had the conjunction, and I totally lined it up by trying to find the stars, the planets, trying to find Jupiter, because I couldn't use the finder. The finder, I have not been able to align real well. I think every time I look through the finder, my head moves a little bit, and then what's in the crosshairs of the finder moves around, and I can't line things up well. I did try and do it during the day, looking across a field at the top of a building, but that was about it. And since that, I haven't really used it. I've had it for over a year. I don't know how to set it up to line it up to be a polar scope. I think it's got it. Maybe it's what they call an equatorial mount. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a German equatorial mount.
Right. It said something about a German mount in the instructions.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to do was to learn how to really set it up so it's ready for me to use. And I don't know if this is the proper venue, or if I can get maybe somebody to come over and work with me on it. I heard somebody said he lives in Gilchrist. I live in Gilchrist, so we're real close, and that would perhaps be more helpful than this, but I don't know. So I'm willing to give anything a try here. Okay, well, you're in the right place. And yeah, we can give you some terms here to use. The part that wraps around the telescope tube, those are called tube rings.
And having those is actually a very nice thing. A lot of inexpensive Newtonians, the tube will screw directly onto the mount, and that's not very good because you can't adjust the tube. Like to get that eyepiece at a comfortable viewing condition, you know, the eyepiece would be stuck at a particular angle, and when you move from one part of the sky to the other, the eyepiece is no longer in a comfortable position. What you can do with that is you can loosen up the retaining screws just a little, and then you can rotate the tube inside of those rings and bring the eyepiece to a comfortable position. So that's one nice thing about what you've got there with that mount. Now, one thing you need to be aware of is balancing the tube within that mount. You can move the tube lengthwise within those rings.
Right.
And you don't want it to get too far off balance, or else it'll be very hard to lock it onto a subject. And so what you want to do is that axis that it's attached to, you want to kind of lay that flat so that the counterweight is sticking out away from you. Excuse me. And the tube is towards you. So that's the polar angle, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
All right, I got to figure out how to rotate these different things.
Yes, yes. And be able to do it in the dark, right?
Right. There we
There
go.
you go. So,
And I did watch a YouTube video, and I did get it balanced this way, kind of, sort of. It's
Okay.
not perfect, but it's pretty close.
okay, and then the other way you want to balance it is on the other axis, not the there's that axis, and then there's the axis of the tube that go, or the bar that goes through, the counterweight bar.
Like this one.
Not that one. That one actually you want to get it set to a position and leave it alone. And that
Okay.
one's on the basis of our latitude here in Florida. And then that one almost never gets adjusted. But the other one, the one if it's spinning on the axis of the counterweight,
Oh yeah, this over here.
there you are. Those are the two axes you want to move on to find things in the sky, and you want it balanced in that axis. So again, if you lay that axis flat like we had it before for balancing the counterweight.
Okay.
So stick the counterweight out away from you, and you see how that tail end of that tube wants to just drop right down. So what you want to do is you want to balance it to where the front end of the tube and the back end of the tube are balanced relative to each other. So you'll slide it through its tube rings to put the nose further out, to put more weight out towards the nose. Just so you know, this is almost exactly the scope that my younger daughter was using at star parties for several years. And she would go out and show people stuff all night with the scope that's almost exact mate of yours.
Okay, so it looks like this is pretty well balanced.
Okay, you can really find out if it's balanced by laying that axis flat. So, and then rotating it. So yeah, you can rotate by tipping the nose up and down and kind of give it a shove and see if it seems to move about the same amount, both up and down, when you give it a tap up or down. And if it prefers one way over the other, it just tells you you need to give it a little nudge.
There, I got it a little nudge this way, that's right.
There you go. I like German equatorials for use a lot, but for hauling, I'm not as much of a fan of them because of the counterweights, because it essentially doubles the weight of the mount. But they're very practical. And I've still got one German equatorial mount. My AVX is German equatorial, and then my my old photographic scope that I left behind with a friend in California, it was German equatorial.
Okay.
Okay.
I might have it all done.
So the one thing that I do to make it easier to find that balance point is I'll put a mark on the tube. In some cases, I'll use a piece of tape, or I'll put a line on. and that will show me where I've balanced it before.
Mhm.
It'll change a bit as you know, like if you put a monster-sized eyepiece in it or something like that, but it lets me at least get close so that I can keep it balanced. So if I'm, say, doing that tube rotation I mentioned before, it'll want to creep one way or another. So like, let's say now, go ahead and lock the axes. So swing it back towards you again, kind of like you had it just a moment ago. Okay, and then go ahead and lock the axes there.
Okay.
Okay, now let's say you want to move that eyepiece to a better position, like facing you. So what you do is do a little bit of loosening, and when you rotate the tube a bit to bring that eyepiece around, it'll want to creep one way or another. So you can fight that part of the time during the night, but what can happen, in my experience, is after you make half a dozen adjustments, it's not balanced anymore. So you can just break out your red flashlight, shine it on there, see your mark, and you can get it balanced back up again.
Okay. Should the finder scope be below the eyepiece? That's where it is now?
It'll change depending on the angle you have it at.
Okay.
And so you can see that your finder scope is quite small. And
Right.
that makes it really hard to use because it doesn't pick up enough light to give a bright image to see what you're trying to find or to see any of the features around it. Your scope is a great candidate for adding either a tail rad or some other reflex sight. A reflex sight is a type of sight that basically projects rings on the sky when you look through it. So Celestron has one now that's, I think, as nice as a tail rad, and it's a bit more compact. And what they do is rather than like a red dot sight, just puts a red dot out there. A tail rad or another reflex sight puts rings. So it'll have like a center ring that's like a quarter of a degree that circles the object you're looking for. And then it has another ring outside of that that is like, say, a half of a degree, and then another ring outside of that that is like a full degree. So you can actually use it to measure your way around the sky when you're finding things. Like you say, okay, I know this thing is half a degree away from that bright star that this dim thing is, and you can kind of step your way across. The other thing is it doesn't put the light on top of the thing you're looking at and block it. It circles it. So it will make your scope a lot easier to use than trying to use it with that little tiny finder. In fact, what I found easier on scopes like yours is just sighting along the tube. Well, often
That's what I did for the conjunction. I sighted along the tube and got it close, and then tried to get it a little more centered.
The small telescopic finders like that, I hate them. You know, they waste money putting them on because they're just not usable. Now, another thing you can do is you can just put on, you know, like a mechanical sight, like a, you know, like a gun sight where you line up the front one with the back one. And that can actually get you very close. Back in the 60s, they used to put those on inexpensive telescopes. They were called a ghost ring sight, and it was just two little metal tabs. The one in the back had about an 1/8 inch hole in it, and the one in the front had about a 5/16 hole in it. And you would just look through the back one, get your eye close to it, and then you would put the thing you're looking at inside the ring of the front sight, and bingo, you were there. And I was so lucky to have one of those on my first department store scope. Otherwise, I probably would have given up using telescopes in astronomy right then and there. So
I'm curious to get into astronomy a little bit more, just for the fun of it.
yeah. Now, your scope is nice in that the equatorial mount lets it follow the movement of things in the sky if you line up the equatorial mount with north. So that other axis that you had, the first one that we were adjusting that I said you'll almost never want to adjust, what you want to do is you want to adjust that to the complement of our latitude.
Okay, I'm gonna have to move this a little bit so I can. Okay, now, the bottom one, which is the equatorial one, do I use that for anything in particular? Is that just to help line it up in the sky to point north initially?
Yeah, let's see. So the one that's at the base that moves the other two, that basically moves the whole scope head,
Right.
that one you just want to line up once for our latitude and leave it there. So unless you take that like to, you know, New York or someplace that has a different latitude than us, you just want to lock that down and leave it. And a lot of times when the scopes have like a hand grip on them on the adjustment for that, I'll replace it with just a straight screw head so I don't accidentally grab it in the dark and twist it and loosen it up.
Gotcha.
Because you want to put that for our latitude and just lock it down and leave it.
Okay.
So we're at almost exactly 29 degrees north. You may have a scale there.
Yes, there is a scale on this side.
So
And
you
it's-
probably want to adjust it for our latitude on that scale. So put it on 29, and then you just want to set it there and leave it.
Okay, well, it's hard to see between 28 and 30. It's kind of a small
Right,
gauge,
right.
but
You don't have to be too precise.
I got it about 29,
Yeah. And for
plus or minus.
visual work, that's good enough. You know, it's if you were doing photography, then you would be doing fine adjustments on it using what's called drift tracking. But you know, for visual use, it's good enough. And what happens is once you get something in it, to keep it in, you only need to move one of the two slow motion controls. You don't move both of them. The one you need to move is the one that spins it around that axis that's coming off of the that base. So it would basically from this angle be rotating like away or toward you. It's and that's the right Ascension.
Yeah, okay, I've got the two extensions. One is lower down. It's close to the closer to the latitude adjustment, and that's moving the scope kind of at an arc,
Right.
Arc left and right. The other one is moving around the vertical axis through the middle of the scope.
Okay, so the one that moves it in the arc is the right Ascension control, which basically that's the one that follows the sky.
Gotcha, that's what I thought. Okay.
The other one is your declination. So right Ascension and declination are the magic words for what each of those adjust. And there are ways of finding things using that. Let's see, do you have like scribe markings on your mount that show like the degrees that it's set at?
It's got numbers on it, but it's not, you know, in terms of 360 degrees, except for the base. Oh no, there's one over here. Yes. Yeah. So the right Ascension, no, that's not rotating at all. I think that's just to help align this, rotate the scope.
Yeah, those are your setting circles.
I'm sorry, they're what?
They're called setting circles.
Setting circles, okay.
And what you do, the procedure for setting them up is more than we can go into here, but there's a book that gives a really good, simple explanation of how to use it and how to use it to good effect to find things in the sky and to be able to move from things you can see to things you can't see. And it's called All About Telescopes by Sam Brown. It used to be told by Edmund. I think it's just generally in publication now. I can't remember who publishes it now, but he goes through step by step, shows you how to set up your setting circles. Now, one thing you're probably going to want is light for the setting circles. In my case, on my old mount, I put a couple of LEDs on the mount to shine on the indicator for the setting circles so I could see what the setting circles were reading. Because in the dark, it's hard otherwise. The other is just use a red flashlight when you're out observing and say you want to be able to step through some of the stuff in the summer sky. There's a lot of different nebulas that you can just easily step to by just moving so many degrees this way, so many degrees that way, and bingo, there it is. That's the 1950s equivalent of a go-to scope, is using those setting circles. And learning to use them effectively, again, it's not necessary for getting a lot out of the scope, but it'll give you, like I say, the power of a go-to without having to fight a computer.
All right, so that All About Telescopes is a good intro book for using the scope?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I figured, okay. I'll have to find a copy of that and sit down and do some more reading.
Yeah, you can probably find it used, because that book's been in publication for almost 50 years or over 50 years. I think it's been over 50 years. It's been in publication. Just find one with the bindings not falling apart. Yeah, 114 millimeter, your scope can catch, from here, I would say you can probably catch about 90% of the Messier list objects, galaxies, nebulas, star clusters, and things like that. And you should be able to capture just about all of the Caldwell objects that we can see from here in the Villages. So there are ones that are too far south for us to see. They're way in the southern hemisphere, but I think about 100 of the objects are visible from here, and so that's another 100 deep sky objects that you could view with this scope.
When I look down the optical tube towards the mirror, I see that the mirror is perhaps dirty. The scope, I think, is 10 years old at least, and wasn't used very much by the two people that owned it before me. Is it necessary to clean the optical mirror?
What I usually advise people is to not bother. A little bit of dust is not much of a problem. If you've got something that significantly blocks the light, a stain, or someplace where water has pooled and left a stain, then in that case, giving it a rinse without touching it is something you might consider doing.
Okay.
If we have physical meetings again, I will probably have a session where I wash people's telescope mirrors. I make telescope mirrors, and I maintain mine, and it's a delicate process, especially with the commercial mirrors, because you can wash the coating off, and that's worse than dust. So yeah, I usually advise people, don't worry about the dust. You look down at it, it looks dusty, and part of that's because the mirror is reflecting the image of the dust, so it looks twice as dusty as it really is.
Mhm.
It takes so much dust that you're really kind of not seeing a reflection to make a big difference.
Okay. All right. Well, I think I got a good start, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Yeah. Hope you get a chance to get out with it and see some things. Again, I think the finder at this point is the weak part of your scope, and that's probably the first thing that you'll want to replace or upgrade, or find some way of working around it. Now, you do have 6 screws supporting it on a fairly tall stalk, so
Right.
it's on a tall enough stalk that you can get your eye behind it, and you've got 6 screws so that if you can get it set, assuming that the foot of it, where it attaches to the scope, stays still, then you should be able to use it. I see we've got a question from Ken about collimation of a Newtonian, and that's where collimation is a fancy word for lining up the optics so that the light goes where you want it.
Right.
And collimation's not too terribly difficult when you think about it in simpler terms. Now, actually adjusting it on some commercial scopes where you have to use a fine screwdriver to get to the adjustments gets more complicated. I put mine with big wing nuts on the scopes that I build. But the first thing is that your diagonal has to be looking at the main mirror. So when you pull the eyepiece out and look down the eyepiece focuser tube, you want to see the diagonal mirror, and you want to see that it is showing you an image of the main mirror. The next step is that the main mirror has to be looking out the end of the tube.
Right. Okay. Eyepiece.
So when you look down there, it takes a little bit of mental adjustment to see the mirror rather than see what the mirror is reflecting, but you should see the secondary mirror. And then,
I see the mirror. I see there are 3 supports 120 degrees apart,
great.
but I don't see all of the mirror, but I see the center part of the mirror where the supports or whatever they are come together.
Okay. So what you'll want to see in that mirror, in that first mirror, is you want to see the second mirror in that first mirror.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay, and it should be pretty well centered. Now, one thing that I often do with people is take a little round sticker, like the little colored stickers that we used to use for marking folders and things like that, and I put it in the center of the main mirror, and then that gives you something easy to center up on. You can also make like a Sharpie mark in the center of the main mirror.
How do we get back to the main mirror, reaching down the tube?
You can't really, you have to take it off the back. And for a mirror like this, I would say good enough, just leave it for now. But if we ever have it apart, like to wash it, then when we wash it, we'll put a sticker on it or mark on it. So you've got that as kind of an alignment mark. And then also looking down the eyepiece tube, you want to look at that main mirror and see if the image of that main mirror is the end of your tube and pretty much even all the way around. So you can't really judge it from there because your eye moves around to so many different angles.
Right.
But when you look through the eyepiece hole, you should be able to see it. Now, the eyepiece hole is big enough that your eye can still wander around a bit. What I've done with mine for my alignment is I took a film tube and I painted the bottom of the film tube or the film canister, an old-fashioned film canister for 35 millimeter film. I painted the end of it white, and then I put a hole through it that was about 1/4 inch, and that helps keep my eye centered up. So my eye doesn't wander around within the eyepiece hole, but it stays centered in the eyepiece hole, and that helps me get a finer alignment. Now, the nice thing about collimation is that once you've got it collimated for a decent construction telescope, it'll pretty much stay that way. And you don't need to make that adjustment all the time.
Mark, I've used a laser collimation tool. Have you had experience with that?
Yeah, I've used laser collimation tools. I've got a lot of friends who use them and swear by them, and it can make it easier. For people who've got a low-end scope, you're looking at spending almost as much on a tool to align it as you would on upgrading your scope. So, so it's not a necessary thing. And for visual observation, you know, getting a good enough alignment just visually is usually enough, especially if you've got something like an alignment mark on the main mirror. I've done visual alignments even for photography, which is, you know, a lot more demanding than just visual astronomy, where a little bit of you know, coma, it's called, that's an optical effect from misalignment can creep in. But yeah, I find that for visual work, just a visual alignment's good enough.
I'm gonna leave you now.
All right, Bert. Glad
Have a
you were
good
able to
evening.
join us. We're getting close to the end, so.
All right.
Okay. Well,
Thank you
you,
again.
Charlie. Yeah, I hope that helps. Hope you managed to get a chance to get it out under the sky.
Well, now that I have it a little better balanced and a little more knowledge about it, and I'm going to read a little bit more about it in the book. So I thank you for your help.
Glad to help. All right. Well, before we wrap up, anyone else have any questions about what we've looked at so far? I'm also going to be looking for volunteers for the next one. So we didn't get one of our people that we had arranged for this time, Jeffrey Cohen. At least I didn't see him. So if you're out there, feel free to let me know. But I didn't see him this time. So for whatever reason, he wasn't able to make it. But if you're interested, send me an email. Or if you're in the Facebook group, then drop a note there. And we'll see what we can line up for next time. 2 seem to work pretty well for the length of time that we want to spend. So maybe we'll just line up 2 next time. And if somebody wants to be a third on standby, we can do that. Okay, how's everyone feel about how this went tonight? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Okay, well, I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. I'm glad of that. So hopefully we can do this again, and looking forward to next month. All right.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Take care. I'll go ahead and close the meeting. Good night.
Good night.